Years ago, I sang with the Campbell River Choir, and with that piece, we won a silver medal in an international competition. An unforgettable performance in which we were completely swept up in the physical and spiritual experience of singing together. Now, there are all kinds of scholarly theories as to why the Song of Solomon is included in the Bible, this sensual, even erotic piece of literature. Most try to read it as a metaphor for the love between God and Israel, or between Christ and the church. But the Song of Solomon is actually part of the wisdom literature. And wisdom literature was written to guide us in our very real daily life and how we should walk together. It speaks to the adage, humans are not physical creatures trying to have a spiritual experience, but spiritual creatures having a physical experience. It was Greek philosophy that taught us to separate the soul from the body. And in our Western thought systems, we still tend to do that. The Hebrew system did not. The spiritual person and the physical person were seen as the same, one being, one wholeness, not divided or separated. So it was normal for the wisdom literature to address every aspect of the very earthly, sensuous, physical life of the human. Now, trying to talk about our bodies, our physical sensuality, which includes that thing that our culture calls sex, is probably the most awkward and most un-Anglican conversation we can have on a Sunday morning. We fail to talk about this adequately with our children, and they grow up getting lost in this over-sexualized world, not realizing the sacredness of their own bodies. We fail to talk about it in our friendships, and too many people go through life lonely, afraid, confused, or worse still, putting up with abuse. Physical touch is vital to our spiritual health. When we were arguing about the new book of alternative services and the peace back in the 90s or the 80s, a widow once said to me, in any given week, you know, the only time anyone ever touches me is at the peace in church. How sad. Then came the pandemic, and we didn't touch anybody. And depression rose, and people actually died of loneliness. We fail to talk about sex and sensuality in our marriages, and otherwise fine and wonderful spouses, some of them even clergy, are lured by curiosity or someone else's loneliness to explore their sensuous life in the wrong places with the wrong people. We fail to talk about it in our churches. And if we do talk about it, we bury the beauty of it under loads of guilt and shame. So that the very people whose faith invites them to live a life full of joy are embarrassed or upset if people try to talk about healthy sex in church. So don't worry, I'm not going to talk about sex in church this morning. I will simply repeat to you what I used to say to couples in marriage preparation. I would look them in the eye and say, you know, in a healthy marriage, there is no sex. There would be that pause. And I would add, in a good marriage, there is no sex, only lovemaking. And that is one of the teachings of this wisdom book, the Song of Solomon. All that sensual, and if you read further on, even sexual language is tied inextricably to love, to care, to respect, to honoring the other. And then with those couples, I would add for good measure, in my personal belief system, I understand lovemaking to be one of the deepest, most sacred spiritual experiences you can have. See, I agree with the Hebrew philosophy It says there's no separation of body and spirit. The most intense physical experiences are also the most intense spiritual experiences. Now, whether you are long past the experience of lovemaking, or whether you're young, single, and terrified of it all, or in a relationship and still trying to figure it out, I suspect that most of us listening to this feel a little uncomfortable. I'm a little nervous myself. I can only say I am sorry about how the church has avoided talking about this, or, worse still, has talked about it very badly. Now, as if it were planned by some divine sense of wisdom, we are hearing this passage in Pride Week. We've seen the images in our newscast of the pride parades with the colorful costumes and the drag queens and the makeup and the banners. And I would guess some of us feel a little bit challenged watching those news clips, a little bewildered perhaps. That's okay. But the one thing we have all seen in those clips is the sheer joy and exuberance that comes exploding out of a pride parade. Well, we shouldn't be surprised when a particular minority population, estimated at 5% of adults in Canada, are subjected to repression, rejection, shaming, and even violent bullying for centuries because of their gender identity. It's no surprise that when mainstream culture finally says, they're okay, you're accepted, they will celebrate. They'll celebrate perhaps a little over the top. At last they're allowed to say, this is who I am. And they're not separating their spirits from their bodily presence. With courage and with joy, they are living out who they are, no longer hiding. And we can and should rejoice with them. If you've read through our Setting Sail, you might have read Bishop Anna's Pride Week letter in which she says, every one of us is made in the image of God, and because of that, we only see the fullness of God when we are all welcome at the table. Every person excluded is a loss to us all. We all miss out on a glimpse of the wonder and beauty of God. I know personally how diminished my own family would have been on Wednesday if our trans, gay, non-binary, and two-spirited relatives had not been welcome at the Canada Day party at my son's house. In the gospel today, we hear Jesus say, come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. What is the easy burden Jesus asks us to carry, but the burden of love towards others, the burden of giving, of gentleness, of humility, of welcome and hospitality? And that's a burden that includes the loving and honoring of our own selves. It can be a burden because there are those around us who want to take the opposite approach of hostility and fear, and jealousy and acquisitiveness. But surely it is so much easier and lighter to give of ourselves rather than constantly trying to take. To be open to others who are different from us rather than trying to bully them out of existence. In the Acts passage set for us by the new lectionary, we hear Peter describe Jesus, how he went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, for God was with him. Not condemning, but healing, welcoming, forgiving, releasing us from our oppressions. I now see, said Peter, that God shows no partiality, not hostility or division, but but reconciliation and hospitality. Our readings began with that wonderful story of divine matchmaking, the story of a man and a woman who found in each other their fulfillment, not by going after some ideal they were looking for, but by being open to what God was giving them. The Song of Solomon hadn't been written when Rebekah followed God's call to marry Isaac, but she lived its role. She rose up. She came away to Isaac, and she found a whole springtime of new life in his arms. It says he loved her. The point of all this is that we of Western Christianity have too often mistrusted or avoided, or worse still, condemned the very physical, bodily experiences of pleasure which God has given us. If we are spiritual creatures having a physical experience, it is not by ignoring or sidelining our physicality, but by celebrating and experiencing it, that we will enter more deeply into our spiritual nature and more deeply experience God's love. Amen.